Hello, and welcome to the CivilTalk podcast. I'm your host, Tapasio Althouse. If you're new to the show, this is where we explore civility and social emotional learning with esteemed guests, expert insights, and practical advice to help people navigate the world. Today, we're excited to welcome Dr. Stephanie Catella to the show. Dr. Catella is a licensed clinical psychologist with deep expertise in cognitive behavioral therapy for trauma, anxiety, and building emotional intelligence. She completed fellowships at the San Francisco VA and UCSF before co-directing the Berkeley Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Clinic. She has also co-authored the Emotional Intelligence Skills Workbook, which combines elements of emotional efficacy therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy to help people navigate challenging conversations and maintain meaningful relationships. Dr. Catella is also a clinician leader and consultant to innovative mental health and tech companies, creating effective therapy programs and tools to bridge technology with well-being and enhance healthcare access. Today, we'll be hearing her insights on building emotional intelligence, managing overwhelming emotions, and leading with values in difficult conversations. We're so grateful to have her on the show. Dr. Catella, welcome to Civil Talk.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks for being here. To start off, I'd love to hear more about your background and what drew you to the field of clinical psychology, especially cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah, great question. So I became more and more curious about psychology actually in my junior year of college. And I started a independent study and was working really closely with a mentor who I really respected. And what I ended up finding more interesting than what I was supposed to be studying was actually how human beings were interacting during the study. And so I just started to do a lot of reading about psychology. And I don't really know how I pulled this off still, but thank you to all the professors that I convinced to allow me to join their classes when I didn't have any of the necessary prerequisites. And I found that I just flourished. I was more engaged in those classes than the classes I had been doing in my major, even though I thought I loved my major. I didn't know I could love something even more. So I just immersed myself in it. And within maybe taking one semester of classes in my junior year, I realized I'm going to get my doctorate in this. I want to become a psychologist. And that's actually when I was also introduced to acceptance and commitment therapy. So I felt really lucky that I was introduced to it at a really early stage in my career and in my development and learning of psychology, because at the time it was actually still pretty new and a lot of the evidence was still forming. We had a lot of the foundational evidence that was kind of leading up to why acceptance and commitment therapy would be created and why it was an improvement on the existing evidence-based therapies. And so I just dove fully into that and never looked back.
That's really amazing that you were able to get there into those programs in the beginning, especially with EET and ACT, which I want to dive more into. Your book, The Emotional Intelligence Skills Workbook, is rooted in those therapies and emotional efficacy therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. And I'd love to hear more about those specific approaches and what intrigues you about it and how they really support emotional intelligence.
Sure, certainly. So my penchant is really for evidence-based therapies, and there's a variety of them. So I'll try not to get too complicated or too heady about it, because this could be its own college course. But essentially, emotion efficacy therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy are forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. And really the main goal of any type of cognitive behavioral therapy is to help you change your behaviors and kind of get out of your own way of sometimes perpetuating the suffering that all human beings experience. So sometimes we kind of trip over ourselves in the process of trying to get unstuck or trying to heal or trying to move through and navigate mental health difficulties or stressors, etc. So to be more specific, emotion efficacy therapy teaches really two skills. One is the ability to experience and accept your emotions. And when we feel like we really can't do that, like our emotions are just too high, like maybe it's a 90 out of 100 or even a 70 out of 100, sometimes it's just too dysregulating to be able to kind of sit in the presence of an emotion. Then emotion efficacy therapy would teach how do you manage those strong emotions so they don't run your life for you? Because that's often
Mhm.
what can happen. When we don't learn how to be with our emotions, they tend to dominate our lives and dominate our decisions. So that's emotion efficacy therapy. It's really quite specific to that work. So it tends to be really focused and targeted. It can be done in a shorter framework or shorter amount of time than a
Mm.
lot of other traditional cognitive behavioral therapies. Whereas acceptance and commitment therapy is much broader. It can be applied to a variety of conditions as well, but it teaches a variety of skills. The ones that really come into play with emotional intelligence are recognizing that your emotion is just an experience, does not define you, that all human beings have emotions, to be able to accept those emotions. And then importantly, how acceptance and commitment therapy really contributes to the development of emotional intelligence is looking at what our values are. And so that's something that my co-author and I put in the book and is really quite crucial, because sometimes people are taught emotional intelligence skills or taught assertiveness or other effective communication skills, but it really has to align with your values in terms of why are you asserting this thing? Why does it matter to you? How does this relationship that you're engaging in matter to you? And
Mm.
using that to help motivate then how do you conduct yourself in the heat of a difficult conversation.
Yeah, I really love this idea. I mean, I think what you're getting at too is just the value of self-awareness and how you situate yourself to your values. How can you be sort of like a spokesperson for your values in a way that is provides efficacy? Because I think people who are really feel strongly about their particular values really want change, and they really want to not debate, but they want to get people quote unquote like on their team and see things from their side. And that's kind of what I find too with values within emotional intelligence, and then being able to iterate them to people who you think are going to listen. Because I think a huge part, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, I think a huge part of um, what you're doing maybe, or a huge part of emotional intelligence, is knowing when and when not to speak, and
Yes.
knowing when you're like with certain people who can hear you and not hear you. I'd love to hear more about your theories on that, and how you incorporate that into your work.
Absolutely. It kind of comes down to, I think, two things for me. There's like the how, but then there's the why. So there's lots of books and resources out there on how do you be an effective communicator. But what I think a lot of them missed sometimes is the why. Why does it matter to you to either talk about this topic or to have a stronger relationship with this person or to improve your communication or ability to connect? Why, right? What would give that meaning to you? What would make that purposeful to you? What would make it worthwhile? And so that's where that values question comes in. And that sometimes helps illuminate or clarify that other point that you made. And I love that you talked about how we sometimes get really kind of stuck on trying to convince other people to align with our values. And a big part of emotional intelligence is assertiveness. And when we're doing assertiveness correctly, like we're doing it with integrity, we're recognizing that other people are other human beings and we're respecting those differences rather than feeling like our job is to force them to come to our side. Our job is just to respect that they may have different values that motivate them than the values that we hold, and being able to still assert ours in a conversation and say, oh, well, here's how I see it and here's why that matters to me. What I'm hearing from you is this, right? Rather than us feeling like our job is always to fight and convince and push. But when we do that, we end up pushing people away from us.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what you don't want. And I mean, right now it seems to be the most appropriate time to talk about this, especially with what's happening right now. But you know, I was reading through your Amazon page for your book, and I was just reading through a few of the reviews, and I really love this one lady, and she said she had an upsetting interaction with her boss, and used in your book, she found situation specific coping thoughts for distressing situations with intense emotions. I'd love to hear. I kind of have a gist of what that is, but from what I can gather, it's sort of looking at your values and thoughts in a non-judgmental way. So I'd love to hear more about that. And so when you have these value systems and you come into a situation that's distressing, what sort of coping techniques can you have so you don't sort of, um, build walls between you and the people who you love?
Yeah, exactly. And very timely, I think, to talk about this as well. So I'll touch on coping thoughts and then I can talk about other coping mechanisms because coping thoughts is one specific way that can be quite helpful for people. But thankfully, there's a variety of other strategies. So if somebody's like, coping thoughts don't quite work for me, that's okay because there's a plethora of others that we know from the evidence tend to be helpful. And really, the work is always to just kind of experiment, try something on, maybe give it a couple of weeks and then see if it's changing things for you. And if it isn't, you just move on to the next.
Mhm.
So, in terms of coping thoughts, really what that reader was getting at is there's a part in the book where we teach people, this also is in the Emotion Efficacy Therapy book. So, really kind of building on the work that Matt and his co author of that book did. But essentially, when we're talking about coping thoughts, we're asking a really specific question, which is for the current situation that is causing me distress, what do I know I've been able to do in the past that I can remind myself of now? So sometimes people want to kind of call it like a mantra. I wouldn't
Mm,
really say that it's a mantra though, because what it is it's an objective truth that we just really can't deny of what do I know I was able to do in the past to get through this? And if it wasn't this exact situation, like the argument with the boss or disagreement with the boss, maybe it's another time that you've had a disagreement and it was really upsetting. What did you know you were capable of in terms of how did you move through that? And so that's really what it is. Like, I know I've been through this
mm,
before. I know I can breathe through it. I know that my emotions come and go. I know that this is temporary, or I trust,
right,
right? What is it? And then once you've identified a few, you rate how strongly do you believe that? And if the rating is a 7 to 10 out of 10, meaning 10 is the most believable, then that
right,
coping thought is probably going to serve you. So then you can put it on a sticky note or put it somewhere on your smartphone, somewhere where you'll see it. And then you kind of rehearse it. And that's what sometimes makes it feel like a mantra. But again, the purpose of a coping thought is I know I have gotten through this successfully in the past.
right. I really love that, and that's kind of I think some people might do that automatically without really knowing that they're actually doing that, and to me, that just sounds kind of like an anchor. I need some sort of anchor that anchors me to my reality. For me, my anchor is always their beliefs say more about them than it does about me. How they react to the situation says more about me or them than it does about me. And that has kind of been my truth, when it comes to either a relative, a friend. It's like they have their own insecurities and problems and hurts and wants and needs that truly dictate how they process information. And the only thing you can do is sort of quote unquote keep your lane clean, I guess, and just be as honest to your values and maybe objective as you possibly can be. Um,
I think if
but
somebody took anything from this episode, that could be it. That
mhm,
depersonalizing stance, right, to use a very clinical term, that depersonalizing stance that you just shared of knowing that when somebody comes to us with something, it's not just that they're reacting to us in this very moment. There's a whole lived experience
mhm,
that has contributed to their beliefs, maybe even their assumptions about us, or those values that they feel like they have to fight for and they see us as a threat to, right? There's all
yeah,
this stuff that we can never really have full exposure to that they're responding to in those
right.
moments. And so I love how concise and simple and just accurate your mantra is.
Yeah, right. It seems to also I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, I can do that with people who are like acquaintances. But when it comes to like my partner or my mom or my dad, I'm like, why? Like it's so much harder to be like, oh, that's on you because you have this like weird emotional invested interest in them, and it's so much harder. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, I know I want to really get into the tech industries that you work in. But to wrap up this, I'd love to hear about like, what are some things that you do or that you found in clients that you've worked with that, you can use when you're talking to people who you are emotionally invested into.
It's going to sound overly simplistic, but that same thing that we were just getting at applies to them. And a lot of it has to come down to we have to focus on can I just accept them as they are and accept that my role is not to try to change them.
Right.
Maybe, and if we can let go of that like fierce sometimes feeling of trying to change someone or get them to our side or get them to see it our way or vote the way that we vote, if we can let that go, then it can be a lot easier to just see their full human self and maybe even be curious about how did they arrive at those choices or how did they arrive at that perspective, rather than
Right.
us feeling like our job is to change it. And the more we try to change someone, and we see
Mhm.
this in the literature with addiction in particular, the more you try to force somebody to change and the more it feels like it's not their decision, the more they're going to retreat and do the opposite usually of what you want. And that's
Right.
true for a lot of human behaviors, this one in particular as well. And so if we can just fully accept that we're our own human being and they're their own human being and we don't have to be exactly alike. And actually the world is probably better when we're not all exactly alike, because then we can contribute in so many different ways. And so the
Mhm.
more we can kind of come together and see it that way, I think the more we can repair a lot of the tension and discord that we see.
Right. Yeah, leading with curiosity and compassion, you know. Um, I'd love to hear more about, so I know you're a consultant for mental health and tech companies, and with the rise of AI right now, I'd love to hear, your history with that and what your goals are with that, and just how you have worked in that sphere.
Sure, certainly. The projects that I've worked on have always kind of met at least one of two goals. Either one, it helps democratize access to mental health care, particularly evidence-based mental health care. We know it's so hard to access in a lot of countries, America in particular. And two is fighting for the underserved and the underdogs because their voices tend to not be heard. And if I can do work that contributes to that and it gives somebody more ready access to evidence-based therapy, then I feel like I've done a really good job. So that's really what's motivated a lot of the work. So sometimes that has looked like helping a company digitize their print content so that it can be more readily available. Sometimes it's looked like creating meditations for an app. Other work, work that's more public that I can talk about now that I'm not under NDA, is the FDA cleared prescription digital therapeutic that I helped create for fibromyalgia, a really difficult chronic pain
Mhm.
condition that's poorly understood, pretty heavily stigmatized. The medications don't work as well. And what was so cool is that the product, where we all had to again come together despite sometimes having very different ideas of what this product should be like and how it should work, right? We talk about CivilTalk. We all had to really collaborate to make this work across
Mhm.
multiple different teams. And what was so cool is that when we did that, we got to see the data, because to get to something FDA cleared, you have to do a lot of research. And what was so beautiful is that it worked, and it worked better than the existing medications for fibromyalgia, which is pretty amazing.
That's amazing. Congratulations on that.
Oh,
That's
thank you.
amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
I'm sure that must have been a very tough role to do, especially when you're spearheading something. So appreciate, to see that. Um, did you find, what were the emotional, or what were the problems that you found as far as civility goes within your team? Um, that you didn't encounter in your sort of like personal practice.
So what were some of the difficulties that I found on the team when we were creating that particular product?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that wasn't a really concise question, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is, as far as working with technology and working within that team, what do you see within the health industry teams that can be improved upon? I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to be, or were you the only emotional intelligence expert, I guess, in that team? I mean, in a perfect utopian world, every person on your team would be an emotional intelligence expert, or at least know what it is. Um, so what challenges do you find, on these healthcare teams, especially when you're dealing with technology? Maybe you're dealing with more engineer and A-sided brain people. What challenges do you find, and how do you overcome them, as far as being able to work with each other compassionately and civilly to create change?
Great. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Great question. I think this probably comes up a lot because to have that many people collaborate with extremely different skill sets requires strong collaboration, but also really strong communication skills. And so you're right, people might have different like professional skill sets that they bring to it, but sometimes the communication or emotional intelligence skills can sometimes actually erode the cohesion on a team. And so what I found, maybe not surprisingly, it was that my role was sometimes to be a mediator and maybe often to be the mediator and do a lot of the practices that are actually in the book, which are
Right.
reflective listening, slowing down heated conversations when people have opposing ideas or when people again feel like, no, this is the direction it needs to go, and someone else is saying, no, this is. And so slowing those conversations down and then really keeping hold onto the integrity of what's the product supposed to really achieve, what's the goal of the product, and bringing that back to the group in terms of how do we stay committed to the shared goal, even though sometimes we have really different ideas as to how to get there. And
Mm.
then sometimes it meant somewhat uncomfortable for me, but good practice with assertiveness was sometimes it meant reminding them that my area of expertise is in evidence-based therapy, and sometimes the ideas that people might have might differ from that. And so how can we
Mm.
make sure that we stay true to make sure that the product is effective? So it's not to say that anyone's idea is better than another. It's just that what we're trying to work towards is a really specific goal, which means that some things just can't kind of fall into that lane. And
Yeah.
then if we want to do things outside of that, we might have to change the goal in terms of what we're trying to create. Meaning, is this an app that we want to get FDA clearance, which means you have to have extremely rigorous studies and data to back it up? Or is this an app that we want to put on the App Store, in which case, there's a lot of creative freedom. There's a lot of ways that we could deviate from what would be evidence-based if we want to go that route. And so those were a lot of things that we had to get very clear on in the beginning. And then once everybody was on the same page, it made it so much easier to navigate when we had those opposing views, because then we could just come back to, hey, I think we all have this shared goal. How do we recommit to that? And so it gave us a shortcut when different difficulties would arise on the team.
Yeah, it seems like with emotional intelligence, a huge factor of it is I feel like less is more sometimes, taking a step back and
Mhm.
just sort of like not talking and thinking and just being there and present with yourself is so important, and I feel like it's so undervalued, and but it's so important to stress its importance in team settings and within yourself too, and I really love that idea of, okay, let's regroup after we, you know, sort of on our own individually contemplate what we want and what we need so we can come back together stronger. And sometimes that just feels like the opposite because you want to make change and you want to go full speed ahead. But one thing that I really love about emotional intelligence really is just the self awareness that you need for it, and how much of it is a solo endeavor before it can really be a group endeavor. And in
Absolutely.
that, yeah, in that way, it's healing. It's like I'm not a religious person, but it's as close to a religion, I think, as one can assume. In the sense where it's like at the core of what I stand for. What is that? I like to believe that humans are inherently good. Most people, most people are inherently good. I like to believe that if you were to sit with yourself, you would believe that there's more good and we all actually have that common goal. It's just how are we going to get there? How are we going to find a way to build the tracks together? But I'd love to hear more about self-awareness and empathy and how that sort of like lack of self-awareness and lack of empathy is a problem in these tech industries, and what they can do when there isn't a mediator, and there's someone who's like, okay, I see the need for mediation. I'm not quote unquote an expert, but what can I do on sort of the macro level to really help?
Sure. Yeah, another great question. This is going to sound maybe quite simplistic, but I think again, we lose sight of it. When we are trying to collaborate and we see that there's a roadblock to it, sometimes we're really quick to judge or make assumptions. And then rather than check those assumptions or communicate our concerns, sometimes we just kind of run forward straight ahead as if they're true, right? We kind of all develop stories about ourselves and about other people. And so something that can be really quite helpful is, one, checking our own assumptions and looking for the facts. So staying true to what's objectively being viewed. And then secondly is remembering that each person is coming to this, again, from their own lived experience. And so the more that we can humanize them and remember all the qualities about them that make them human, the more easily we can actually stay in contact with them instead of the division, right? You're in the way, you don't agree with me, I'll just go around you, right? I'll just ignore you, I'll steamroll you, all these things that actually really erode trust on a team and make it more difficult for that team to be productive. And so if everyone can kind of align on values around group cohesion being important from the outset of a project, then it's a lot easier, again, to create that shorthand language around, oh, hey, I think we've gotten misaligned. I think we've gone in a direction, and then everyone's committed to it. So that's one way to do it on a group level. On an individual level, sometimes it means somebody has to kind of rise to that place of being the person to slow things down, to either use reflective listening or to check their own assumptions. And again, seeing the other person as, or the other people as, full human beings rather than as obstructions. So I think that's something that we can just easily get entrenched in. Well, you're just in the way, right? And so then we just get frustrated and dismiss them. But it's usually going to be a lot harder to achieve what we want together if we continue to just kind of symbolically push people to the side. Oh, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah. How can leaders sort of cultivate that as well? Because it seems like leaders and business owners tend to just be, I don't want to say short-sighted, but they tend to just kind of think about the goal in mind and not so much the process of it, which is important. It's an important factor. But how can leaders be assured that they're hiring the right people and that they are creating a team that is going to be able to manage that sort of cohesiveness?
Great question. I think a leader would have to value the process as much as the outcome, and value each human being as much as the product. There's a good World Health Organization quote essentially saying that the health of an organization is dependent on the health of its workers. And the health of its workers is really facilitated by the top. You know, the top sets the example for how to conduct ourselves in an organizational setting. And it's those people at the top that have the most power and influence over what are acceptable behaviors, how do we get things done, how do we communicate. And so we, as leaders, we have a huge responsibility to make sure that we are seeing each person in the organization as a human being that's contributing to a shared goal. And again, if we see them as obstructions or barriers, it's going to create a toxic work environment. And that's when people tend to leave. I can't give examples because of the work that I do, but there's so many examples just floating through my head right now of organizations where I've worked with those in leadership positions at them, and the leaders who did not value the human beings that work for them, their organizations were chaotic. They were inefficient. Their products were delayed. They didn't meet timelines. Maybe they weren't earning as much money as they thought they were. So it actually created a lot of chaos, and it tended to get in the way of the exact goals they were trying to achieve. And so if we can kind of change our culture to one of valuing that there's a reason why we hired this person. There's a reason why we chose this person, and let's trust their expertise, but let's also create a work environment in which each person's voice is heard while still being collaborative. Because what happens sometimes is the loudest voice or the person with the most power gets to make the decision. And that tends to lead to a lot of attrition in the workplace, where people leave and find other settings where their expertise is seen and recognized and appreciated as a contributor rather than as a road bump.
Right. I love the idea of what you're talking about, sort of makes me think of the cliche statement, and it's about the journey, not the outcome, and it's like I really love the idea of equalizing the passion for the journey and the collaboration as much as the monetary whatever award that you will receive in the outcome. And I think that, you know as you were mentioning earlier, if you can level the two and understand that sort of journey and that commitment to collaboration is just as rewardable as the outcome, it could lead to that, because I think you're right. There is this sort of, I'm going to put the outcome first before the journey. But
Absolutely.
yeah, for those who feel, discouraged at all right now, and we might have to wrap up soon since we're reaching the 30-minute mark, but I'd love to hear your insight on, to people and to our listeners and your listeners currently who feel discouraged by current divisions in society, and what role emotional intelligence can foster or can have in fostering empathy and understanding and ultimately a more civil society.
Certainly. I think if emotional intelligence was taught in every single school setting at a young age, culturally things would be so different because we would have the requisite skills to hear differences, to respect differences, to have empathy, to also maybe see that sometimes somebody does have a shared value. They just see a way of getting there is different from how we do. And so I see emotional intelligence as playing a really crucial role in helping provide a salve to these divisions and allowing people to be curious and have compassion and empathy. But I think, just like what we were getting at earlier, it really has to start first with the inner work that we do ourselves, because it's really difficult to be in a challenging conversation or interaction with someone if we can't first be with our own emotional discomfort. So that's paramount
Right.
to developing any of the other emotional intelligence skills. And so you can really learn them sequentially so that it's easier, and then apply them in increasingly difficult situations. So first is
Mhm.
just learning how to be with your emotions. And then it's learning some of those really important, effective communication skills. And then it's applying them with someone that you love and trust, that you know is going to give you grace if you make a misstep as you're learning something new. And then you can start applying it to the difficult conversations. So it kind of sounds like, oh, that's a long journey, right? I think sometimes people feel discouraged. It doesn't actually have to take that long. I think a lot of the work can actually happen in a matter of weeks, especially if
Mhm.
we're committed to consistent practice of it. Otherwise,
Right.
we're going to be in the same circuitous situation where a heated conversation comes up. It brings up really uncomfortable emotions for us, or we're jumping to conclusions or making assumptions or blaming them. And then we don't get to a place of resolution. Instead, we just continue to either miscommunicate and misunderstand each other, or create more tension and distance in the relationship. And so I really think, to quote Robert Frost here, the only way around is through. We have to go through the discomfort and learn that we can sit with it
Right.
to then be able to mend some of that tension.
Yeah. I love the step you mentioned where being able to communicate with someone who is going to provide you grace in a moment where you might misstep, because along the way you are going to make mistakes and you're going to say something incorrectly, or maybe without as much compassion or empathy. But and this is a step that I think about in my day to day too, is like, can you surround yourself with people who are on your team, no matter what, for the most part, and are there to gracefully guide you to a place where you're like, where they can sort of correct you, or they can be a safe bouncing board for you. And that's a process I think that we don't talk a lot about on this podcast, but is a good reminder, and I think a good takeaway from this discussion in general.
Absolutely. Yeah, use those people that you love, that you know love you, to help you improve in the ways that are meaningful to you, improve in the ways that align with your values. So that's really going to be what gives life so much meaning, and what also feels like it gives you a sense of agency in a time that otherwise feels discombobulating and helpless.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And also, I mean, as someone who also is very active in, speaking my mind or whatever, there are moments when you're around people who are, just debaters or do not lead with grace and tend to make sort of the more confident people just cower, you know? you don't you don't want to do that because those are your lovely dominant traits that make people make change, you know? And so I think that's important too, you know, is to remember like what your values are, but also like what your strengths are and like leaning into that, you know, and being
Mhm.
able to find people who like really bring those strengths out and, you know, can make that a common anchor in your day-to-day, or whether it be work or stating your values. But I want to thank
Absolutely.
you. Yeah, I want to thank you. If there's any takeaways you want to take or you want to impart to the listeners today, we'd love to hear that before we wrap up.
I think one, just that emotional intelligence is really, actually two things, is really quite teachable and it's very measurable. So you can see where you're improving. And so if people want that data, it's available to them. There's lots of great measures out there. There's a measure in the book that they can use. And then it gives you an assessment tool where you can take it again and see, oh, okay, so I'm strengthening in this area. Here's the next area to focus on. And again, it just makes it more achievable. It makes it more palatable and easier to kind of work through those sequential steps. But then the second thing is maybe just a question to really keep in mind and ask ourselves, which is when we're in a difficult interaction with someone, what do we want to be proud of down the road in terms of how we handled it? Because typically the things that we do in the heat of the moment where our emotions have taken over, we're not often proud of those. That's when we tend to say or do things that can be hurtful, even if we didn't actually mean it. They just kind of sometimes ekes out, right? It has to come out somewhere. And so if we're not sitting with our emotions, it's going to come out at the wrong
Mhm.
time. And so that is sometimes a motivation and a good question to ask ourselves is what do we want to be proud of after this conversation?
Right. Right. Thank you for that. Dr. Steph Catella is talking about her book. She co-authored the Emotional Intelligence Skills Workbook, which we will be linking on our website at www.civiltalk.com/podcast. We will have that link up on our site, as well as the video and the podcast itself. So if you're interested, make sure to tune in to civiltalk.com or on Spotify or Apple Podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who you might think might benefit. Dr. Steph Catella, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me and for all the work that you're doing. We just really need this. So I appreciate your willingness to do the hard work too.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise. And again, to our listeners, Dr. Steph Catella's book and her website is chock full of really great information. Also, her LinkedIn articles are fantastic, as well as past podcasts she has recently done if you want to hear more about her insights. Again, thank you so much. Until next time, keep striving for civility and empathy in all that you do. Thanks so much.
Thank you.